Hi, I'm Deboki and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I am going to be going over my 2019 reading highlights and lowlights. I did this last year in place of like a favorites and least favorite reads of the year video because I just find it easier to do. I tend to overthink things when I'm ranking books. Maybe this year will be the year that I finally figure out how to do that in a low stress way because it is actually a low stress thing. But until then, I kind of like doing things more in terms of the themes of like things that went really well in my reading and things that were a little bit frustrating in my reading. And some of that is like stuff that's on me and some of that is on, the books that I read. So this video will involve me talking about some of my favorite reads for the year, but yeah, it's not necessarily like these are my top books of 2019 kind of thing. So like I said, this is more about the themes of my reading, so I'm gonna alternate and go back and forth between like highlights for the year and then lowlights for the year, just to, yeah, talk about some things, some patterns that I noticed in my reading. So I'm gonna start off with probably my biggest highlight for the year, which is that I think this year was a good year for me to read through some of my feelings about culture and family that I've been having, and in particular how that relates to like choices I've made in my own personal life and professional life. There are two major books that kind of stand out to me in this regard as like helping me kind of work through these feelings. The first is Chemistry by Weike Wang, and the second is Mistranslations by Sopan Deb. Chemistry is a book that's been out for a while. I finally read it this year because I was finally in a place where I was ready to read it. It's about an unnamed grad student in Boston who is basically coming to terms with whether or not she should still be in grad school, while also facing other crises about like her personal relationships. And there's a reason it took me a long time to read this book. This is one of those books that I think if you're in grad school, if you're doing life sciences or any kind of sciencey grad school PhD thing, and maybe if not, this has maybe been a book that people have recommended to you, especially if you've been like figuring out like what the point of it all is. And that's because that is kind of a central question of the book, not necessarily in the grand scheme of like what is the point of academia, but like in this one specific character's like journey, she's processing kind of why she decided to go to grad school and what it means in terms of like this personal journey she's been on. So it's not necessarily specifically about grad school, it's about how grad school plays into stuff that she's like, I don't know, taken on from her culture and her family. This is a book that I knew that I should read, but because I was still in grad school when it came out and a lot of that stuff, like I was in my most peak moment of going through, like I was like at my most stressed out about grad school because I was finishing my dissertation, trying to get a job outside of academia, like a lot of stuff that was just too much for me. Like I could not read this book at that time. But now like I'm like a year or two away from that. It was a little bit easier to read, and so I finally sat down and read Chemistry, and I had a lot of feelings. I did a whole vlog about it. It's like a 30-minute vlog, which to be honest, I think originally was like 90 minutes and I had to edit out some of those feelings. But it's a book that really stuck with me, not just for the grad school stuff, like that is obviously like chemistry's in the title, you know that science and research and all of that is a part of the core of the book. But the reason why this book really like hit home for me was the way that it connected it to a lot of like personal questions that the narrator is asking herself about her family and how that ties in with being from a culture that's not from the US. That book I loved. Mistranslations by Sopan Deb. I read this as an ARC. It's coming out in April this year and I'm super excited about it. Sopan Deb is Bengali American. This is his memoir about reconnecting with his family after like kind of a long, not formal estrangement, but just like a very long period of time of not talking to his dad, of not communicating super frequently with his mom, and him basically rebuilding his relationship with them and understanding a lot of how he was raised as well. And this is a book that's very much about like family and forgiveness, and it ties in a lot of specific cultural things related to being Bengali American. I'm also Bengali American, so there's a lot of stuff in terms of that culture that for me really resonated. And I think part of why this book really stood out to me while I was reading it is in part because it is a memoir, it's nonfiction. I've read more books that explore these themes in connection to Bengali culture, like in the fiction world. I don't often see it in nonfiction, and that might be partly my own blind spot, but I think also it's just there's a lot of cultural things that make it difficult and to figure out how to talk about growing up in this weird tension that affects how you understand yourself, how you understand your family, yeah, and just figuring out how to talk about that with a culture that may not immediately understand it the way that you want them to understand it. Mistranslations actually kind of reminded me of this like moment from one of my high school classes. It was in an English class. We had all just come back from spring break. It was our senior year, so we were kind of like all checked out. So our teacher asked us just kind of like a general like, what's a thing you like learned over spring break? And the thing that kind of came up a lot, weirdly, not with everyone, but it was like a frequent, I don't know, idea that a lot of us were having was this, or not even idea, it was this question, which was just like, what do our parents do all day? And that's like such a teenage thing to ask, right? Because like when you're a teenager, a lot of your day is decided, you have like all of the structure, and you look at your parents who are like one of the people giving you those structure, and you're now at this point where you're like, gonna say bye to them, and the natural question is like, what are they gonna do without us? And this book made me think of that conversation, as well as like a moment from Hassan Minhaj's Homecoming special where he talks about how good immigrant parents are at keeping secrets, because this book itself has like the sense of just like there's so much stuff that like our parents have done. And I think when you're a child, it is natural to like see your parents first and foremost as parents, and then that changes as you get older and you start to like reach the age that they were when they had you, or like if you're a first or second generation American, you reach the age where your parents made this huge immense decision to move to another country, and you're now processing like, crap, like how the heck did they do that, and then also have a kid and raise me, this little asshole, you know, like that kind of question. And I think like a lot of children of immigrants, like I've grown up, you know, with that understanding that my parents made a huge immense decision to go to another country and have me, and like they did it for a reason. They thought it would give me a better life. And so like there's a pressure, there's a love, there's a gratitude, there's a lot of complicated feelings too wrapped up in that. It's a complicated thing to think through. The older you get, the more you get to the point where you feel like, well, did I live up to that potential? And I think both chemistry and mistranslations really like approach those questions in their own specific ways. That might not be the specific question that they're always seeking to answer, but I think it's about understanding like, yeah, how you were raised, how it relates to the way that your parents were raised, and what that means for you. And just there's no clear answer. Like these are not books that are about getting an answer to that question, because it's always going to be an individual personal thing. But it's a meaningful thing to ask and to constantly check in on. And I think in the past year or two, I've just really hit a point of like thinking about this a lot in the context of the choices that I've made. And I've talked to a lot of friends who have had similar feelings and sort of assessing the academic and professional and personal choices that they're making. And so reading these books together was just like a really, I don't know, it was just a really nice way to kind of think about these things without being caught up just in the specifics of my own life, but to think about them, whether it's in a fictional context or a memoir context, how they play out in different ways. So I'm really glad that I read these books last year. They just have meant a lot to me personally in terms of thinking about these things, and I'm excited for Mistranslations. If you're interested in it, I will be probably talking about it more later on in the year because, like I said, I am very excited for its release. So yeah, that is my biggest highlight for this year, for sure. One of my unofficial highlights for the year is that I actually kind of had a hard time coming up with lowlights. This is maybe the first year that I've really felt like regret for all of the books that I didn't read, but that's really more about not making the time for reading rather than like a specific number of books I read. And I'm also going to talk about it more in my 2020 reading goals video, so I don't really want to get too much into that right now. So I will say one of my reading goals that I did fail at miserably was that I really wanted to finish reading all of the Kushiel's Dart series this year. Kushiel's Dart is a series by Jacqueline Carrig, and I really love the first trilogy in that series, which is Phaedra's trilogy. It is one of my favorite series. I reread it quite frequently. It's actually probably one of my most frequently reread series, books, whatever, of the past decade, just because I love the writing, I love the world. And Phaedra, like as this character, has such a strong, lovely voice, and every time I read it, I just feel fully drawn into her world and the weird adventures that she gets into and like the romances that she has, like all of it just works so well for me. And every year that I reread the series, I get like a little bit further in actually like completing the whole series. Like I'll read one more book and then one more book in the series. series. And so this was gonna be my year where I was just gonna finish them all. Like, I was just gonna do it. I was just gonna get through all 9 books because I'm so close. I love the series anyway, so I might as well do it. But I did not succeed because the first trilogy is good, Phaedra's trilogy is good, Imriel's trilogy is okay. It's not great, but like, it's solid. I actually kind of enjoyed it, like more than the first few times that I tried to read it. There's still some issues with it. Like, there's some stuff with the magic, like building, the world building of that magic, I guess, that I don't like. I think it's very hodgepodge and kind of almost feels like writing a really like hasty computer game where you're kind of just making things come in just to be obstacles than to actually like have the plot like tell a full story and build a complete world. So that was unfortunate that I didn't like those elements, but I did care enough about the characters who were in the series that like I was still enjoying it overall. Then I tried the first book of the last trilogy and I struggled. I got through the first book, but it's just, I thought I was going to enjoy the fact that the series takes place like a century or whatever, like after Imriel's trilogy. Like, I thought it was gonna be really cool to like hear about how all of these stories that like I loved from those books are now legends in this character's world. But that was about all I really enjoyed about it. The rest of it, the plot was very thin. The magic was even more frustrating to read. It felt even more like a video game because it felt like the heroine was just collecting powers the way that you can collect powers in a game just by like, I don't know, running over a little whatever magical token. Clearly I do not play that many video games. It's been a while since I've read that book. I tried it in the beginning of the year because I was like fully motivated to get this goal done, but then I just gave up on the rest of the series. I might regain that motivation. Maybe next time I reread Phaedra's trilogy, I'll end up finishing the whole series. But for now, I'm just gonna let that goal be and accept it for what it is. I do think I'll give Jacqueline Carey's other books a try because I do want to see, I don't know, if she ventures outside of this world, like if these magical issues kind of like go away and maybe like with a fresh world, fresh rules, like things build up a little bit better, because I do love Phaedra's trilogy so much, and I do really want to relive what I love about that writing in another setting, like in something new. Okay, so highlight number 2. This year I rediscovered some romance authors who I had previously kind of had like not mixed feelings on, even just kind of like neutral feelings on. And then this year I like just reread their books and suddenly like loved a whole bunch of them. And that's always an exciting feeling because it's always great to find authors that you love, even if they're authors that you previously read and didn't love. This seems to be very specifically about writers of historical British romance featuring characters of varying sexualities. The first author is KJ Charles, who I think is probably one of the best known writers in this genre, or like in the specific subgenre. And I've read her books for a while and I've liked them, but I've just never quite clicked with them. But at the end of this year, I read her book Any Old Diamonds and I loved it. I think from the summary, I had kind of like an inkling that I was gonna like this book, but I don't think I fully understood how much I was going to love it. This is a heist book. I mean, it's a romance novel, but it has a heist, so like perfect. And it's about Lord Alexander Pine Fuchs. I don't know if I said that correctly. So this Lord Alexander, he has been trying to get revenge against his father because his father has treated all of his children like crap. But Lord Alexander is also like not necessarily like the most intimidating guy. He's not necessarily the most crafty guy. Like, he's like a nice dude. He's just really pissed off at his dad. So he decides to enlist the help of a jewelry thief named Jerry Crozier to help him rob his dad of this super valuable diamond. Or jewelry. Some kind of jewelry thing. This book completely surprised me, not just in terms of how much I loved it, but just like in terms of the basic plot. It kept me constantly on my toes, which is what you want out of a heist novel. And I ended up basically immediately purchasing and reading Gilded Cage, which is the next book in the series. And I think Gilded Cage is like the first book of KJ Charles that I've read that features a female protagonist. And I still loved it. I didn't like it quite as much as Any Old Diamonds, but it was really good. Like, I think the emotions and all of this stuff, it's a story about like two people who were previously in a relationship and then like because circumstance had to end that relationship and ended it very bitterly, they basically are coming back together and like having to reunite and so like deal with mysteries because one of them has been framed for murder because of course, and so through the course of that, as one does, they reunite. And so that kind of stuff I love too. Like I love mending a broken relationship like that. But the story itself didn't quite grab me as much as the heist in the first book did. So it didn't register quite as much as Any Old Diamonds, but I really enjoyed both of the books, and so I'm now kind of in the process of reading the other KJ Charles books that I haven't read. The other author that I sort of rediscovered, this is Cat Sebastian. So I talked about this a little bit in a video last year, so I'm not going to get too much into it, but I had read Ruin of a Rake by Cat Sebastian before, and there were parts of it I enjoyed and also parts of it I didn't, so I'd kind of just been like, I think Cat Sebastian's just not for me. But then I decided to read Hither Page this past year, which was a newly published book by her, and I really ended up loving it and kind of was like, well, let me revisit that series that Ruin of a Rake is a part of, and I reread it from the beginning and was like, oh, all of the stuff that I didn't like about Ruin of a Rake is really fixed if you read the full series. So that's another case where it's like an author who, like, by actually reading more of their books, you get to see more of what they're doing and find parts of their writing that you like, and just discover it in a new way. I know people like love snarky reviews and stuff, but it's always a really good feeling to find an author you love, and it's also a very good feeling to find that there are authors who maybe you didn't click with at first, but that you eventually grow to enjoy. Okay, Lowlight number 2. This is a very minor thing, it's really unimportant, but I really wanted to have the same number of lowlights as I do highlights, so I'm just gonna throw this out. I struggled with some Booktube faves this year, and no, I'm not talking about Ninth House. Like, yes, there are a lot of people who loved it, and there's like also a lot of people who didn't enjoy it, but like I think the consensus of that book is like still developing on Booktube. And like, speaking of consensus, you're never gonna 100% agree with the consensus, so this is fine. Like, we all don't have to like the same books. All I'm saying is that Longbourn and Margaret the First are okay books, but I didn't enjoy them as much as I thought I was going to based on the hype that I had gone into reading them with. And for the last highlight, this was a year where I felt like I got to read several books about sexual harassment, assault, and rape that felt like they were part of something, I don't know about bigger, and I don't know about new. I never want to like overstate how far we're coming in terms of our discussions about how we treat victims of sexual assault, or how like we support victims of sexual assault, or how we deal with rape culture in general. But there is sort of like an underlying hope that we're at a turning point in terms of how the broader culture at large is starting to talk about a lot of these issues. So this year I read Say My Name by Chanel Miller, Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow, and also Gia Tolentino in Trick Mirror wrote this really great essay called We Come From Old Virginia, which was about sexual assault on college campuses. These are not the first books written about sexual assault, and they won't be the last. But for me, in terms of my own personal reading journey, they feel like they're significant, like there's something significant about this year where all of these different things are being produced. I forgot to mention, but it's because I haven't gotten to read it yet, but She Said by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey also came out in this past year and was about the New York Times investigation into Harvey Weinstein. There's just something about being able to see the journey that my own reading has taken and seeing how it aligns with like what is being released, that it feels meaningful to be able to have had this year where you get first-person accounts of someone being able to very specifically take on the image that was created of her in the wake of like a very publicized trial, as well as like a reporter talking specifically about the institutional powers that were at play that tried to prevent him from reporting on an incredibly powerful person who is using his power to rape women. Last year, when Brett Kavanaugh was getting nominated to the Supreme Court, I made a video about rereading Speak, which is a YA book written by Laurie Haltz Anderson, and that I think was probably one of my earliest encounters with rape in a fictional setting. And there was a lot of things that, like, rereading it as like someone who was older compared to when I read it as a teenager, there's a lot of things that I understood in terms of how that book fits into like how we talk about boys and girls and men and women, that like as a teenager I was just starting to learn, and like at that point in time with the conversations that were happening around Brett Kavanaugh, like we're fully getting cemented into like how I understand a lot of these issues now. And so I think these books feel very much connected to that. And Say My Name by Chanel Miller, like it's like this nonfiction continuation of Speak almost, like in terms of a lot of the themes in the book, and also just like down to the title, like the very sense of this command, that sense of ownership and like taking back something that's yours, but also like instructing other people. And so I really I don't know, it's always weird to talk about these things as like a highlight, as a bright spot. And I think one of the things that's also worrisome in this context is like the fear that this is just going to be a trend in publishing, and that it's also going to be just a trend in our discourse, and that we're not going to actually in the long term make the substantial changes that need to be made. I see this especially in publishing, where you see books marketed as like Me Too narratives, and like I feel like that's super annoying. Like it's a very like euphemistic way of talking about sexual assault and harassment, like reducing it down to a hashtag that, like, while important, is also not representative of like the whole story. And that kind of thing worries me. But like publishing is huge and complex. I'm not going to put all of my like hopes for a huge shift in culture just down on the publishing industry, or like down on people who have to like sell books. But I'm thankful for the writers of these books for like shedding light on these issues, whether by sharing their own like stories or helping to investigate them, especially in light of like the professional and personal costs that doing so can entail. Last low light. I think this is related to the other one. I think I'm building up books too much. There were a lot of books this year that I was like excited about because they're authors who I read a lot. Like I love Alicia Rai, I really love Sarah McLean. There's just like these romance writers and other writers who had books that came out this year that I was like, yep, I'm gonna read them, and I still have not read them. And part of that is because I haven't committed the time to it, but part of it is I think sometimes when you come to love an author too much, you get to be worried that you're not going to love their new thing, and then you put off reading it. And I think that's happened to me a little bit, and I think that's not good. That's it. That's my low light. I'm sorry that my lowlights are not more exciting this year, but also I'm not sorry because it means that my reading year was like a pretty solid year. I think the cynical take is that the reason why I don't have that many lowlights is because my reading this year was not that exciting, which actually I think is a little bit true. I don't think I like really challenged myself too much this year with my reading. But yeah, I think next year I'll probably end up challenging myself a little bit more, and then maybe next year's lowlights will be a little bit more, I don't know, thrilling, and not just be like, sometimes I got disappointed and sometimes I disappointed myself. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Bye.